Our text today is taken from the Gospel according to Luke in the 2nd chapter, the 30th through 32nd verses. Mine eyes have seen thy salvation, which thou hast prepared before the face of all peoples, a light for a revelation to the Gentiles and the glory of thy people Israel. These are the words of Simeon, and in the Christmas story, the account of Simeon actually comes fairly late in the narrative. But the language that he uses is the language of the prophets recorded in the Hebrew Scriptures, long before the birth of the Lord. He invokes the imagery of the Lord's advent as a coming of light, as did the prophets of old. Isaiah, for instance, proclaimed, "The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. They who dwelt in the land of the shadow of death, upon them the light hath given darkness." These contrasting themes of darkness and light are familiar as we head into the Christmas season, which comes in the darkest time of the year. The coming of the Lord as light appeals to and can enlighten everyone. But Simeon makes specific reference to the light coming as a revelation to the Gentiles. In doing so, Simeon again echoes Isaiah, as in these words, "I, Yahuwah, have called thee in justice, and I will take hold of thy hand, and will preserve thee, and I will set thee for a covenant of the people, for a light of the Gentiles." Still, the message may seem as though it is simply a general message of good news. The Lord's advent benefited everyone, both near and far. But the heavenly doctrine, as always, invites us to look more closely, to consider who these Gentiles are, and in that way to have the words of the text speak to us in a more specific and meaningful way. So who are these Gentiles of whom both Simeon and Isaiah speak? The Hebrew word that Isaiah uses is goyim. And if people are at all familiar with this Hebrew word, they will probably know it as a term used by Jews for those who are not Jewish. And this suggests a point about which many new church people may need reminding. The term Gentile in English is most commonly employed in the very same way, as a synonym for non-Jew. This is worthy of remark, since in the heavenly doctrine, and consequently in new church usage, this is not the way it is generally used, the meaning having been transferred to make reference most frequently to those who are outside the sphere of Christianity rather than that of Judaism. So new church people need to realize that if they use the term in this way, the term Gentiles, outside the bounds of their denomination, they are likely to be misunderstood by the majority of their listeners. The confusion extends further, however. Goyim is also often translated as nations, as is the Greek word translated Gentiles in our text. And likewise, the Latin word gens, used in the heavenly doctrine to render these words, is also sometimes Gentiles, sometimes nations. The latter often when the word is paired with the word peoples. And indeed, even the passage from Isaiah quoted earlier, "I will set thee for a covenant of the people, for a light of the Gentiles," is often rendered for a covenant of the people, for a light of the nations. Conversely, the opening sentence of today's service, "Praise Yahuwah, all ye nations, extol him, all ye peoples," could have begun, "Praise Yahuwah, all ye Gentiles." Given its frequent pairing with peoples, nations is often thought of as simply a synonym for peoples. But the heavenly doctrine points out, as with many other pairs of apparent synonyms in the word, there is a hidden spiritual meaning for the pairing. Typically, such double expressions reflect the divine marriage of good and truth in all things of the Word. And so too with nations and peoples. Nations being a celestial term which relates to good, and peoples a spiritual term which relates to truth. There is nothing in the modern concept of nations that would suggest why it ought to relate especially to good. But the problem is that the modern understanding of the term nation is quite different from the biblical concept embodied in the Hebrew word goyim, or the corresponding Greek or Latin words. When Genesis 10 gives an account of the repopulation of the earth by the descendants of Noah, the chapter concludes, "These are the families of the sons of Noah, according to their births, in their nations, and from these were separated the nations in the earth after the flood." And regarding the use of the word nations in this context, the Arcana explains, the most ancient church was distinguished into houses, families, and nations. A married pair with their children and their men servants and maid servants constituted a house. A number of houses that were not far distant from one another constituted a family, and a number of families a nation. Hence, nations signified all the families taken together in aggregate. So, in the biblical sense, a nation is more like a clan or a group of related tribes. And the Latin concept of a gens is quite similar, an extended family going back to a common ancestor. The word genetic coming from the same root meaning. The Romans believed that each gens had a special guardian spirit whom they called a genius or a genius, which again derives from the same origin. This special character or disposition of each nation, each gens in the ancient sense, is reflected in the teaching that, quote, "there were different kinds of worship in the ancient church in accordance with the genius of each nation, of each gens." With such an understanding of what is meant by nations in Scripture, we can begin to see how nations relate to good or love. So let us look at one more passage from the Arcana that sums it up. "The rule of love toward the neighbor prevails among those who dwell separated into houses, families, and nations. But the rule of love of self among those who dwell together in a society. Among those who live separated into houses, families, and nations, it is the father of the nation, and under him the fathers of the family, and under these the fathers of each household who rule. He is called the father of a nation, from whom come the families, and the families the households. But all these rule from love, like that of a father towards his children, who teaches them how they ought to live, bestows benefits upon them, and so far as he is able, gives them of his own. Nor does it ever enter his mind to subject them under himself as subjects or servants. But he loves them, he loves that they should obey him as sons obey their father. And as this love grows, as it descends, as is known, therefore the father of a nation acts from a more interior love than the immediate father of the sons himself." So, ideally then, a nation in the word refers to a larger unit of human society which is still bound together by love of the neighbor. A people, on the other hand, refers to those who have in common only the fact that they are under the government of one ruler. Interestingly, the heavenly doctrine points out kings have reference to peoples, thus not to nations. The children of Israel, before they sought to have kings, were a nation and represented good, or what is celestial. But after they desired a king and received one, they became a people and represented not good, or that which is celestial, but truth, or what is spiritual. So, what are the Gentiles who are referred to using the same word as the nations in the original languages? Notice that in our lesson from Isaiah, the Gentiles were paired with kings. And the Gentiles shall walk to thy light, and kings to the brightness of thy rising. As we might expect from what has gone before, kings refer to those who are in truths, and the Gentiles to those who are in good. These are obviously not mutually exclusive categories, though, as this prophecy looks forward to the visit of the three kings, who were not simply Gentiles with respect to the Jews, but also magi, learned in ancient prophecies in the Word regarding the Lord's advent. And in the text itself, the Gentiles are similarly contrasted, but now with Israel, a light for a revelation to the Gentiles and the glory of thy people Israel. Here we may understand Israel relating to truth, and specifically those who have truth directly from the Word, and the Gentiles as those who are in good and yet are in ignorance, a darkness without light. Both of these groups, both of these categories, benefit from the coming of the Lord, but each in their own ways. The prophecies of Isaiah, and even the utterance of Simeon, most specifically regard the state of the world at the time of the Lord's first advent. And in that context, the Gentiles can be seen in the traditional sense of the non-Jews. But in an extended sense, these prophecies carry over to the Christian era and the next grand cycle of darkness and light in human spiritual progress. So who are the Gentiles in this next cycle? Historically, Christians tended to refer to non-Christians not as Gentiles, but as heathen. This term, however, clearly has negative connotations, and those connotations go along with the traditional notion that all those outside Christianity must necessarily be damned, unless, of course, they converted to Christianity. In the new church, though, we meet a very different idea of the non-Christians. Not only does the heavenly doctrine speak of the Gentiles being saved, it often says that the well-disposed among the Gentiles may be better than the Christians. How can this be? How can those who are ignorant of much of what is taught in the Word be better than those who are well-versed in its teachings? The answer, as it is stated in the work Divine Providence, is that in the spiritual world, the world every person comes into after death, no one asks what your faith or what your doctrine was, but what your life was like. Every human culture has a basic code of moral or spiritual conduct which corresponds roughly to the Ten Commandments. And every human being who lives a life according to such a code, trying thereby to benefit the neighbor and society at large, is on the path to salvation. So if such a basic set of precepts is all that is really needed, and people can possess these precepts without any direct knowledge of the Word, why is it even necessary for some to have the Word, to study it, and to pursue what may seem to be complex and abstruse doctrine? In times of happiness and light, a simple and straightforward life based on that may be all that is needed. But when the spiritual state of humankind grows dark and obscure, those who have a simple, straightforward moral code become confused and can easily be led astray. They become the people who walk in darkness or who dwell in the shadow of death. This is the point at which the references in the prophecies to light or glory become important. Those who dwell in darkness obviously are in need of the light. Spiritual light is clearly truth, but it is the Lord as the light that is promised in the prophecies that we have looked at, and this light is identified with his glory. People may commonly think of glory simply as fame, renown, or honor. But in the word glory is predicated of light, especially the spiritual light flowing into the natural. The Arcana explains, "It shall now be told what glory is. Glory in the supreme sense is the Lord as to divine truth, and thus it is the divine truth which proceeds from the Lord. But glory in the representative sense is the good of love to the neighbor, or charity, which is the external good of the celestial kingdom and the internal good of the spiritual kingdom of the Lord. The spiritual heaven is called glory because whatever is there appears in light, in brightness, and in radiance." So, this is what glory means. Let us now consider the related word, glorification. There are two distinct ways in which this word is used in Revelation. One, the more familiar usage in English, to celebrate in song or in words of tribute or praise. The other usage refers to the process whereby the Lord made the human in himself divine. At first, there may not seem to be much connection between these two usages, nor yet between these and the idea of glory and light. But all these may become more meaningful to us if we begin to see some relationship. Glorifying the Lord, in the sense of praising or celebrating him, might be termed giving him glory. And, of course, there is the theological truism that we cannot supply the Lord with any good thing which he does not already possess. As the Arcana again says, "They who are not in the knowledge of interior things cannot believe otherwise than that the divine wills the humiliation and the submission of man as man does who is in the lust of glory, and consequently that the divine wills glory therefrom and is affected with glory which man ascribes to him. But the case is altogether different. The divine is not in any affection of glory, for what glory has the divine from man? But he wills the humiliation and submission, not for his own, but for man's sake." To speak of giving glory to the Lord is similar to speaking of blessing the Lord, when in fact it is he who blesses us. And indeed, the words of our text, the words of Simeon, were introduced by these words, "And he received him into his arms and blessed God," concerning which we are taught of Zacharias and Simeon, we read that they blessed God. Here it is evident that to bless the Lord is to sing to him, to proclaim the good tidings of his salvation, to preach his wisdom and power, and thus to confess and acknowledge the Lord from heart. They who do this cannot but be blessed by the Lord, that is, to be gifted with those things which belong to blessing, namely, with celestial, spiritual, natural, worldly, and corporeal good. These, when they follow each other in this order, are goods in which there is happiness. So, blessing the Lord means to ascribe to him all blessing, and also to pray that he would bless, to give thanks for having been blessed. Then giving glory to the Lord, or glorifying him, would similarly mean to ascribe to him all glory, and to pray that he shed his glory upon us, and to give thanks for having received it. And the Lord is able to shed this glory on us because he came into the world to glorify his human, to become the Word made flesh, as we are told at the beginning of the Gospel of John. And the Word was made flesh and dwelt in the tabernacle among us, and we observed his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. And if the connection of glory with spiritual light is not clear enough in this, we need only look a few verses earlier. He was the true light, which enlightens everyone who comes into the world. It was the Lord incarnate, the Word made flesh, from which this new glory broke forth. The idea that the Lord's advent enlightens everyone who comes into the world brings us back to the point that it was not only for those within the church that the Lord came. The Lord's advent made possible the salvation of the Gentiles as well. Not simply that those who do not have the Word can nevertheless be saved if they live the life of charity to the best of their ability, but, quote, that by means of the Word there is also light for those who are outside the church and do not have the Word. So those who have the Word can serve a use not only for themselves and others within the church, but also for those outside of the church, indirectly as it were, insofar as they read the Word and practice its precepts in their lives. So far they also increase the enlightenment available to those who are unfamiliar with the Word. But clearly, the opportunities of those within the church are not limited to this. Jesus taught in the concerning this in the Sermon on the Mount, again using the comparison with light. You are the light of the world. A city that is laid out on a mountain cannot be hidden. Neither do they light a lamp and put it under a bushel, but on the lampstand, and it shines for all who are in the house. So let your light shine before men, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in the heavens. The light of the Lord's advent was not only to allow for more indirect light to reach the Gentiles, it was, in the words of Simeon, for a new revelation. And how is this new revelation to reach them if they are not already in possession of it? Some within the church have the role of letting the light shine by teaching and preaching and otherwise proclaiming the good news of the Lord in his divine human as revealed through his second advent. But note that the focus of the Lord's words in the Sermon on the Mount is on your good works, letting the light shine in an exemplary life of charity, to the point that others who observe it will glorify, give glory to your Father who is in the heavens, which we now know means that we can, by our own actions, make it possible for the Lord's spiritual light to shine. Amen.